And he said, not only did they advertise, but he said, and they then, quote, they began, quote, efficiently supplying a demand that it had evolved. So they efficiently supplied the customers, and then it gets even worse if you want to read about dastardly crimes. They doubled and redoubled their capacity to fill the demand and embraced every new opportunity with a great organization manned with elite business personnel. Therefore, he found them guilty of violating the anti-monopoly laws and fined them $1 zillion. And the antitrust laws do involve prison sentences. You know, the judge could send you to jail for this sort of thing. And so here's another example of a company. What are they doing? But even by their critics, making stuff cheap year after year after year. And then the critics, when all else fails, the critics resort to the theory of predatory pricing. They say those clever monopolists, here's what they're going to do. They're going to do what Rockefeller did. They're going to drop the price of refined oil from 1865 to 1911, the year 1911, 46 years. And if they do that, they'll probably drive everybody out of the market. Then once everybody else is gone, then the sky's the limit for the price of oil. Okay, so they're going to lose money on purpose on every barrel of oil, maybe for 30, 40, or 50 years. And then they'll drive everyone from the market, and then they're going to make a killing. And I'm not making this up. This is a very popular theory, predatory pricing. And I talked about this in an MBA class of mine once in Baltimore at Loyola University. And a lot of my students were like, I would have like the vice president of marketing for the McCormick Spice Company. I would have lots of engineers from Black & Decker. Black & Decker had a headquarters in Baltimore. And I would ask them, well, what if you went to work on Monday and said, this class, this MBA class, which your employer is paying for, the professor told you, you should say something like this. Well, you know that drill at Black & Decker that it costs us $30 to manufacture, that's the marginal cost. Let's start selling it for $5. And then it might take us 5, maybe 10 years, but we'll drive all the other drill manufacturers out of the market. And then we'll sell it for $500. And these guys all just said, well, I'm fired on the spot. You know, not only would I not pay my tuition next semester, but I'd lose my job for a crazy harebrained theory like that. But it still is a popular theory that businesses will lose money on purpose for decades at a time. And of course, Rockefeller never did that. You would have to be a damn fool to do that, and no matter what else anyone has ever said about John D. Rockefeller, he was no fool. And neither were any of these other real capitalists who made so much money. Another example of this phenomenon is Cornelius Vanderbilt. Elementary school students used to be taught the story of Robert Fulton inventing the steam engine. I don't know if they still are or not. They're probably taught all sorts of politically correct stuff now in its place, as far as that goes. But Robert Fulton is credited with inventing the steam engine. But what you probably didn't learn at school, if you ever heard of Robert Fulton, is that the state of New York gave him a monopoly in steamboat traffic on the Hudson River. So it was illegal to compete transporting people from New York to Connecticut on with Robert Fulton. So he was a political entrepreneur, in with the politicians in New York State. And along comes a young man named Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was hired by a wealthy businessman to break up the monopoly. And so he ran a gypsy steamboat up and down the Hudson, charging nothing, and making money by selling food and drinks on the boat. And he had police chasing him up and down the river, and they finally just gave up. And so did Robert Fulton. They said, "Oh, the hell with it! We can't compete with this guy," because he was so popular. Because they were charging $8 at the time, and here comes Vanderbilt charging nothing, but selling. You could eat breakfast or lunch on his boat, and that's how he made money on the food. And it was a low volume, high volume, low margin business, just like the grocery stores. He didn't make a killing on every customer like Robert Fulton was, but he might have made a little bit on every customer, but he had a lot of customers because free transportation to work was a pretty good deal to a lot of people. And so, so you probably didn't learn about that. You might have learned about Fulton, but not that he was a political entrepreneur. Okay, another one second type of illustration. This will be the last one I'll have time for, I guess, of this phenomenon of interventionism or crony capitalism being responsible for problems, economic problems, which are then blamed on capitalism, is based on the Herbert Hoover myth. In one of my classes a couple of years ago, when I teach a course in American economic history, and when we get to the 1920s, I asked the class, who knows anything about Herbert Hoover, President Herbert Hoover? And nobody said anything. One guy raised his hand and he said, isn't he that guy that used to work for the government who wore women's dresses?
Okay.
And, there apparently was a book out a couple of, there's a movie too about J. Edgar Hoover and this. But anyway, I was kind of shocked that no one knew anything about Herbert Hoover. Maybe that's a good thing, I don't know. But I was shocked that these 18, 19, 20-year-old college students, none of them knew anything about, the Great Depression is a pretty significant period of American history to know something about. But anyway, there is the Hoover myth. Well, what is the Hoover myth? The myth is that Herbert Hoover was a devotee of laissez-faire capitalism. And because of that, we had the Great Depression. Capitalism run amok, and the wheels fell off somehow. The famous economist John Maynard Keynes said animal spirits were at fault. In his famous book, The General Theory, he blamed animal spirits. That's what academics do when they don't know what the hell they're talking about. They make up animal spirits. It's like Ouija board economics, animal spirits. But it's called Keynesian economics now. But if you just would study what Herbert Hoover did as president, this idea that he was an advocate of laissez-faire is preposterous. If you would just study what he said about the topic prior to becoming president, you would think, well, it sounds like nonsense to me that he was an advocate of laissez-faire. But of course, actions are more important than words when it comes to politicians. So what did Herbert Hoover do as president? Well, he had been in the government long before this, and he was quite the interventionist when he was Secretary of Commerce. And so anyone who ever studied Hoover would have to know that he was no advocate of laissez-faire capitalism as the Commerce Secretary. And so what the first thing he did, what he was pretty well known for, is during the Great Depression had just started, he was sort of strong-arming corporate executives to raise wages during the Depression. And he would call them in with conferences and have negotiations. And of course, whenever the government calls you in for a negotiation, it's always a gun under the table negotiation. It's always, you will do what we want you to do, or else we can pass a law to force you to do what we want to do. And so maybe he wasn't literally holding a gun under the table while they were negotiating, but that's always the threat that, we can audit your taxes, we can regulate your business, we can impose a tax on your industry. You don't even have to say that. That's always the unspoken understanding when you're in a room with the government officials in Washington talking about them wanting you to do something that you do not voluntarily want to do. But this, of course, was a very bad idea, because the only hope a lot of people had of keeping their jobs during the Depression was to take a pay cut. Okay, if I take a pay cut, and if everyone else takes a pay cut, maybe the employer can afford to make the payroll. He can pay all his bills because his revenue has been cut by 2/3. His business is off. But if we insist on on raising wages, nobody has a job. We're all out of work. The business is bankrupt. And that's exactly what happens whenever this phenomenon happens. So what Hoover was doing was exactly the wrong thing. And Roosevelt continued this by passing laws forcing wages up by law. And so he made it even worse, by the way. At least Hoover was only pressuring employers to raise wages during the Depression. Think about it. We're in a depression now, really. If you look at the real unemployment rate, if you count so-called discouraged workers who have given up looking for a job, even the Fed says the unemployment rate will still be about 16% if you count discouraged workers, which is Great Depression level unemployment. And so, who thinks that if you want to get a job, we're in a bad economy, a lot of you students who are seniors are probably thinking about looking for jobs. Are you more likely to get a job if you ask for the going rate in that industry today, or double that rate? What is going to increase your likelihood of getting hired? Demanding double the going rate or the going rate? Well, Herbert Hoover was trying to tell the employers, force them to pay double, or not double, but more than they're paying in a depression. And that is a recipe for unemployment. He devoted 13% of the federal budget in 1929 for public works programs, for the old dig a hole and fill it up type of public works programs. That is more than double the proportion of the Obama stimulus program. So this was a much bigger stimulus, so-called stimulus spending program in terms of a proportion of the federal budget than either Bush or Obama in recent years. And of course, this sort of thing never works because of the economic law of opportunity cost. Government can never create a single job on net because it has to take the resources away from the private sector through taxes, through borrowing, through printing money, which creates price inflation. One way or another, the government has to take from us in order to give somebody a government job. And so what government does is only to rearrange the kind of jobs. It stimulates government employment and stimulates voters for the politicians who gave them jobs. The voters who got government jobs will vote for the politicians who gave them the jobs. But it is always at the expense of destroying private sector jobs. It didn't work for Herbert Hoover, and it has never worked for anybody else. But it's a popular thing politically, because the jobs that are created are visible. You can see them. You can see the people as you're stuck in a traffic jam and you're cussing up a storm because you're late for school, late for work. You can see the stimulus program, right? All those orange cones, and they're digging up the pavement and repaving it again. That's called stimulus spending. Okay. The idea that can create a job is like saying that you have a swimming pool in your yard, and there's the deep end over here, shallow end over there, and you say, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get a bucket of water out of the deep end, and I'm going to dump it in the shallow end, and the overall level of my pool is going to rise. That's basically what you're saying. You're saying government can create jobs by spending money. And government destroys jobs by spending money because it has to take resources from the job-creating part of the economy. The private sector is the sole part of the economy where jobs are created. And so Hoover did that. He was a much bigger stimulus spender than Obama or Bush as a proportion of the federal budget. Huge tax increases. He had to raise taxes enormously to pay for all of this. Well, who would argue that that's a good idea? John Maynard Keynes didn't argue that. Even the Keynesian economics says the appropriate tax policy in a depression is tax cuts, not tax increases. But there were huge tax increases of all kinds in the Hoover administration. At the time when the country needed tax amnesty, the politicians took even more money out of the pockets. That, by the way, if you students who take macroeconomics, you'll learn all these convoluted models and so forth. But the essence of macroeconomics is that prosperity is created when the government takes money out of working people and spends it on non-working people. That's basically what Keynesian economics pretty much says. Productive working people take their money away from them through taxes and give it to people who are going to vote for us. That's basically, that'll create prosperity. That's in a nutshell, Keynesian economics. I had to get a PhD in economics to finally understand that. Here's what Rothbard said about Herbert Hoover's tax increases. The range of tax increases was enormous. Many wartime excises were revived, sales taxes were imposed on gasoline, tires, autos, electric energy, malt, toiletries, furs, jewelry, and other articles, so everything. Income taxes went up, and so forth. He started the business of paying farmers for not growing crops, Federal Farm Board. He signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which raised the average tariff, which is a tax on imports in the country, to 59.1%, the highest in history up to that point. The whole rest of the world retaliated by putting high tariffs on American goods, so that the total volume of world trade shrunk by 2/3 in 3 years because of this trade war started by the Smoot-Hawley, it should be called the Smoot-Hawley Hoover tariff. he started the business of the government getting involved in allocating capital with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And he also supported the Fed's creation of the bubble that burst, creating the Great Depression. There was a bubble economy during the 1920s, helped along by the Fed and the expansionary Fed in the late 1920s. And that bubble burst, just like the bubble burst in '07, also created by the Fed here. And so maybe to fast forward to today, as I'm running out of time here, but I can make one or two more comments about the Depression years. Is that the unemployment rate by 1940 was still 14.6%. So when FDR came along, he just continued Hoover's policies. They just went much further than Hoover did. In my book, I quote Rexford Tugwell, who was Franklin Roosevelt's chief domestic advisor from 1933 to 1945, saying that just about everything we did was just an expansion of what Hoover started. And it was true. They did. And of course, nothing worked because this was all very bad economics. And I don't have time to explain much more detail, but the proof is in the pudding, as they say. At the beginning of the Great Depression, the unemployment rate in America was 2.9% in 1929. By 1940, after all the so-called New Deal programs, it was still almost 15%. It was still about 5 times higher than the normal unemployment rate. So it had been a total failure. And so the Great Depression did not really end until 1946. The World War II did not end the Great Depression. That's another myth, another economic myth, because you had about 5 million unemployed Americans. The government drafted 11 million men into the military. Surprise, unemployment disappeared. But the people who make the argument that World War II ended the Depression are making a crucial assumption that is ridiculous. They're assuming that a man or a woman who has a job, they go to work, they earn a paycheck, they come home and have dinner with their family every night, is the same as the man who's drafted to go sit in a frozen foxhole and have bombs dropped on him in Germany. Because that's what happened to 11 million, something like that. And so to say that the government can take 11 million men and send them overseas is a good way of ending a depression. Always sounded crazy to me, but that's the gospel according to Paul Krugman, isn't it? And all the other Keynesians who spread this kind of nonsense. The Great Depression finally ended. The year 1946 was the middle of the government's demobilization. The government's budget, federal budget, went from 97 billion to 33 billion, from 45 to 48. Almost about 2/3 reduction in absolute dollars in government spending because the military was demobilized primarily. 1946, the private components of gross domestic product, private consumption spending, private investment spending by businesses, rose by 30%, according to the government's own statistics, and that's by more than double the amount of economic growth that has ever occurred in any other year in American history. So 1946 was the most rapid year of economic growth in all of American history, and it was in the middle of a massive defunding of government spending. But the Keynesians, who still haunt us today, or I guess they do more than haunt, preach the opposite. They would say that this should have been a disaster, a 2/3 reduction in government spending. That's what we need today, by the way. That's what I would recommend today for starters to get us out of this depression. Eliminate the income tax and replace it with nothing would be a good start. And if we did that, government spending would be about what it was in the year 1998. It's not like we would revert back to eating worms and garbage if that were to happen. And so, so if you fast forward to today, we see the same myth today. We had the Great Recession, as it's called, in '07. One of the initial theories of the cause of it by the media, the Washington media, was as follows. Alan Greenspan knew Ayn Rand in the early 1960s. Ayn Rand was an advocate of laissez-faire capitalism. Therefore, the recession of 2007 is caused by laissez-faire capitalism. You may have heard that argument somewhere, maybe in one of your classes here at Furman, students, but that's an argument that was made. Second argument that was bandied about was greed caused it. No greed on Wall Street prior to '07. You know, they're all angels on Wall Street. And there's an explosion of greed. Oh my God, where did all this greed come from? Need I say more about that? But that's still what people are talking, greed on Wall Street. And then when all else fails, you blame the partial repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which allowed banks to associate themselves with investment banks. Well, what it did not do was allow banks to get into the stock business. It just allowed them to associate, in a business sense, with investment banks, and very few of them actually did. So it really had nothing to do with the other seven. What caused the Great Recession was the Greenspan bubble. The Greenspan, Alan Greenspan's pursuit of zero interest rates for 6 years after the previous stock market bubble burst that was also created by the Fed's expansionary monetary policy. That's the main cause of the problem. But everything but the Fed, of course, is to be blamed. It's private greed, corporate excesses, and so forth. And Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, some of you who have studied about this, I've written about this in my books and elsewhere. The government for a long time had been pressuring mortgage lenders to make bad loans to unqualified borrowers. And the word the government made up to describe these loans was subprime loans. So the implication is that, if I did my credit report tonight and I got an 849 credit rating, that's like the best you can do. Well, subprime would be maybe 848. It's below prime. But not really. We're talking about people with credit ratings of like 300. Horrible credit ratings. They never pay their bills. They walk away from the bill. But the government had pressured mortgage lenders for years to make trillions of dollars of these bad loans. They gave Countrywide Bank a special award, the Fed did, for having made $1 trillion in these loans. And the Countrywide Bank, 2 weeks later, was bankrupt because of all these loans the government pressured them to make. But the government understood that, well, how are we going to get these banks to make all these bad loans? Bankers make bad. What's in it for them? Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac will buy them from you, Mr. Banker. You make the loan, and you earn the fee for the loan. You borrow money from a bank to buy a house, they charge a fee. They might charge $1,000 for the processing fee, let's say, for the loan. They pocket the $1,000, and they immediately sell the loan to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, which are government-sponsored enterprises, and Fannie and Freddie securitize all these bad loans, bundle them up into big bundles of bad loans, and somehow magically they were supposed to become good loans because they were bundled. It was called securitization. But it was the government that forced these banks to do this. And of course, the bankers who went along with it deserve a lot of blame. They knew what was going on. They knew it was a scam, but they made a lot of money. But this was not the free market. This sort of thing would never happen on the free market. This was crony capitalism once again. And then of course, when the dam burst, when we had the Depression, what is the first thing the Fed does that created the Depression is to bail out the same people it had been working with year in and year out to create the Depression, the big banks, the big New York banks mostly. So it caused that guy in the Yankee hat to sort of take his Yankee hat off, the New York banks. But so it's the same old story. It's the same old story of crony capitalism or state capitalism causing enormous problems in the economy and blaming it on the free market exchange system of capitalism. And so maybe I'll quit for, at that point it's about 8 o'clock, and we'll have time for Q&A if anyone would like to ask questions, make a brilliant pronouncement, anything like that. Feel free. These two are in charge, so we'll do whatever they want. Yes, sir.
Have you done any research or writing about the Green Agenda and the Agenda 21 of the United Nations in connection with Obama and his agenda?
Well, I've sort of read some about it. And somebody brought this to my attention, the Agenda 21 thing. It reminded me of when I was in graduate school back in the 70s. I remember reading the exact same thing, but in different language. They didn't call it Agenda 21. And so, it's nothing new under the sun. It's a lot of talk so far. But I call these people watermelons. They're green on the outside, but red on the inside. And if you want to, I actually wrote an article about it on bluerockwell.com. It's called The Watermelon Summit. It was about the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro last summer. Because I've studied and researched the environmental movement a long time. A book I wrote in 1985 mentioned all of these characters in it. The book was called Destroying Democracy. But in this article of mine on bluerockwell.com called The Watermelon Summit, I quote the late Robert Heilbronner, who was an economist who wrote a book called The Worldly Philosophers. And he became a millionaire. He was a socialist, a self-described socialist, but he sold so many copies, like every student who took Principles of Economics in the 50s and 60s and 70s was forced to read this awful book, almost every student, The Worldly Philosophy. He left all the conservatives and libertarians out. Milton Friedman was not in it, even though Nobel Prize winners, if they were not leftists, were not worldly philosophers. It was only the Karl Marx